Hello, everybody. I'm John Denny with the Telos Corporation, and welcome to Xacta Tidbits. We've got a great treat for you coming up. We're going to be doing an entire series all about controls implementation. And in this video series, we're going to be starting off with just showing you the basics of controls implementation. So let's get started with the basics.
All right, everybody, we are inside of Xacta 360 and we are looking at our projects. I'm going to go directly into my Xacta Tidbits project, and my active task is security control implementation. So we're going to click on this active task, and on the side we see that our process step of controls implementation is ready to go. So we'll click on controls implementation. The first thing that we're going to notice here is that this is set up as a card-based or Kanban style view of the page. That means each of our different controls that's listed here is going to be a different card. So you can see this is the AC10 control, but if I click on the next card, this is the AC11 control. So we can move between our controls simply by clicking on our card. The next thing that we're going to want to do is change our sorting option. The current sorting option is by the control rank, but to make this a little easier, we're going to sort this by the control ID. What this is going to do is sort everything by the AC or AT or AU or IR, whatever the controls are, in alphabetical order, and then the numerical. So this is going to show me my AC1 control, and then my AC2, and then if we keep scrolling down here, we would see our AC3 control, and so on and so forth. What we're going to want to do at this point is make a determination of how many controls that we have to implement and how many of those controls are inherited. So down here at the bottom of the page, we can see down here that I am currently viewing 200 of my controls. The total number of controls that I have is 796. So I have 796 controls for this particular system that I have to implement. Now, how many of those controls are inherited controls? We can use our drop down by the inheritance here, and we can choose to look at inherited only controls. Once we click here, this is going to show me that I have six inherited controls. And I can see that these are inherited by the word inherited next to the control. Each of your inherited controls are going to show up as implemented. Each of these controls are all implemented, which means that these are fully in place on my system already and were inherited from a common control provider. Now, because these controls are already implemented and have been inherited as implemented, this means that these controls I do not have to answer. They have already been answered for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to filter these out. So these 6 controls, we don't want to see them because I don't want to accidentally look at these controls and think that this is something that I need to work on. So we're going to filter those out. So we're going to use the drop down for our inheritance again, and this time we're going to choose system only. System only. And this is going to remove those 6 inherited controls. So now I can see that I'm down to 790 controls versus 796. It has removed my 6 controls that I would use for inheritance. So here of these controls, I can see that these are all system-based controls, and their status is currently blank. So of these controls, their status is blank, which means I have not done anything to them yet. So we're going to start with this AC-1A1 control for access control policies and procedures. When we look over here at the access control policies and procedures, we can see that there's some details about the control right here. If I'm unsure of what's supposed to happen with this control or how to implement this control, I can click on the control details. This is going to bring up a pop-up that's going to allow me to see information about this. So we can see all the information of what is supposed to be done with this particular control. Is there any related controls and what the references are for this control as well. Down at the bottom, we can see that there are associated control tests that are going to correspond with this particular control. In order to implement a control, we need to be able to work with the control details. So we're going to start by changing the status of this. For any control that is fully implemented, in other words, a control that is in place for your system, we are going to choose implemented. That means the control is in place. When was the control put in place is going to be your completion date. So we'll put in today's date using our calendar and say that this control was implemented as of today's date. Now, we don't really need to use a priority in this for this particular purpose here because this priority is not, we've already implemented this control, so I don't need a prioritization for this. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take this control that has been implemented and we are going to describe the details of what we did to implement this control. That's going to happen down here in the system control information private implementation. So we'll click inside of here and this is where we could type in whatever we did to implement this control. Because this is an access control policy and procedure, I'm going to be a little generic here. So we'll say that there is an access control policy and procedure in place for this control. So there is a access control policies and procedures. In other words, there's some kind of guidance that's in place for this particular control. Other things that are available to me would be any additional comments. And also in the personnel area here, I can assign control owners and responsible entities. We will be talking about this in much more detail in part 3 of the series. So now that I've answered this control or the basic information about the implementation, I need to scroll back up here to the top. Once I've scrolled back up here to the top, I need to save the changes that I've made. So I'll click on the word save. Once I've clicked on the word save, we notice that this AC1 Alpha 1 control has now changed to a status of implemented. So this control is now implemented for my system. Now we may have other controls that are out there that would have things that are in a planned state. That would have something that was in a planned state. Now if I was searching for a specific control, let's say I was working with incident response policies and procedures, and I knew that those were going to be in a planned state. I may go in here and type in incident response. So incident response, this is going to allow me to search for anything that has the words incident response in them. And when I press enter, this is allowing me to see all of my controls that have the words incident response. And here are my incident response policies and procedures. Now let's assume that this incident response policy and procedure is in a planning state. In other words, we're not 100% sure how we're going to implement this, or maybe it's in the process of being implemented, but we haven't implemented it just yet. What we're going to do is we're going to work down here again in our control details, but this time we're going to change our status to planned. So our status is now planned. When we have things that are in a planned status, it's a good idea to give it a prioritization. And as you can see from your prioritization, you have a P1, P2, P3, and P0. P1 would be your very high prioritization items, P2 would be your mediums, P3 would be your low, and P0 would be for informational purposes. So we're going to leave this as a P1 because incident response policy and procedures, that's a pretty heavy document that we need to make sure that we have in place. So we're going to leave this as a P1. It is not implemented, so therefore we're not going to put a completion date in here. In our private implementation, we would type in the details about what's going on with this particular control. So for something like this, we may say that we're in the process of writing the incident response policy. That's our process, that's what we're doing, and we'll say that our estimated completion date is, and we're going to put this, we'll push this out a month, so we'll say that this is going to be 15 January of 2025. That is my estimated completion date of when the incident response policy will be completed. No other details are required for this, so we're going to go back up to the top, and just like before, we've made changes, we need to click our Save button. Once we click our Save button, we can see here that the IR-1 Alpha 1 is now in a planned state. It is now in a planned state. Now we're going to remove our search so that we can see all of our controls again. So we're just going to delete what was in the search, and with a blank search field, we'll press the Enter button, and this is going to put us back where we were. Now at any point that we want to look over our implementation details, we can look at the implementation here, and we can filter by things that are either implemented or planned for implementation. So if I do have things that are left in a planned state, I can always click on Planned, and as we can see, here's the IR1A1 that is in a planned state that we answered earlier. Anything that was in an implemented state would show up, like our AC1 Alpha 1. This is in an implemented state. So those are just a few different ways that we can work with some of the basics of the controls. Now when we do have these changes that we're making to controls, we can see who made these changes to the controls, because that question does come up quite frequently. Who implemented this control and who typed in these details about this private implementation? You can always go up here within any control and you can look at the history of this particular control. So when we click on the history button, this lets me know that the private implementation was changed by user John Denny. It was changed on 12/2/2024. Its implementation status was changed and its completion status was changed. So you can always look at your history to be able to view and see what was going on with any control at any time and who made those changes. Now, a question that I get asked quite often is, what do we do about controls that we cannot put in place on our system? In other words, if we put this control in place on our system, it is going to break something in our system, or it's going to break the functionality of the confidentiality, integrity, and or availability of our system. In a case like this, we'll choose a particular control, and we're just going to assume that this control right here is something that we cannot implement. This control is something that we can just not put in place for this particular system. We are going to leave this as a not assigned. It's obviously not implemented because the control is not in place. It's not in a planned status because this is something that we cannot put in place. So I'm not planning to put this in place. I just can't put this in place. So what we'll do here instead is in the private implementation, while leaving everything else alone, we're going to type in the details of why we can't implement this. So we would put details in here describing why we cannot put this control in place on this system. Remember, things that you're going to want to talk about here are why this control cannot be done because it will harm confidentiality, or it will harm integrity, or it will hurt your availability of your system. Something about this control, if we put this in place, is going to have a detrimental effect to the system, or in some cases have a detrimental effect to the mission requirements of the system. But that's what you'll do for things that you, for some reason, you cannot implement that control. And just like all the others, we will save this. Now again, this status is going to remain blank because we could not implement this control. Now there are other ways that we can work with some of our controls in order to update multiple controls at the same time. And that's known as bulk edit. So what we're going to do is we are going to assume that we are going to answer our control policies and procedures all the same way. So up here for the first one that we answered, which was implemented as of today, I'm just going to copy what we already answered here. And what we're going to do is we are going to apply this same configuration, this same controls implementation for the rest of our access control policies and procedures. So I'm going to select the AC1A2, the AC1B1, and the AC1B2 control. Once we have all three of these selected, we can now choose what's called bulk edit. Once we choose bulk edit, we can go up here and we can assign it a status. Now because the first one was implemented, we're going to choose implemented for our controls. We're going to choose today's date as the implementation date, and the private implementation is going to be the same thing that we did before. So we used our hotkeys or Control V on our keyboard to paste in the same implementation details. So those three controls are all going to be implemented as of this date with this private implementation in place. I can then click the Save button. It's going to say, are you sure, because you're about to update 3 records at the same time? Yes, we are sure. We'll click the OK button, and this has now implemented all 3 of those controls as well. So now we have the AC1A1 control implemented, but also the Alpha 2, the Bravo 1, and the Bravo 2 control as well. And if we click through them, here's the A2 control, and it has the same details as before. This one also has the same details, and then this one also has the same details as the other. So if you do need to bulk edit your controls, this is how that you would do that. So this is the basic information that would be required for you to go through and implement your controls. In the next parts of our series, we're going to be talking about how we can assign personnel to our controls for the My Controls portion. Also how we can do export and import for our controls. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we can go through and work with our supplementary artifacts. But this will conclude our video on the basics of working with controls implementation.
For more great content, make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel to get the latest Xacta tidbits.